Hey guys, tonight we will step together into the shadows of a name that, at the mere mention, has shaken the course of history. Henry VIII. A king who possessed everything a man of his time could possibly dream of. Absolute power, rare talent, and a kingdom ready to submit to his every command. But do not let the golden veneer deceive you. Henry VIII was the man who wrote a book to defend the Pope, only to later tear the church apart with his own hands, crowning himself as the supreme head of faith. He swore to love a woman until his last breath, then sent her to the scaffold simply because she did not give him a son. He was once a handsome and intelligent prince, a musician, an athlete, a storyteller, a passionate lover, and then became an executioner of his own wives, closed the monasteries, and hanged those who dared remain loyal to God. Was Henry VIII a genius? Or just a child who never grew up, terrified of abandonment, needing to control the hearts of millions? So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. End of. And now, before we begin this journey through the cold stone walls of the 16th century, tell me, where are you right now? What time is it where you live? Are you listening to this story in broad daylight, or in a dark room with only a lamp on, and a slight shiver as you picture Henry's gaze? Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. This story does not begin with bloodshed, but with the uneasy calm of a kingdom recently emerged from civil war. Henry VIII was born on the 28th of June in the year 1491 at Greenwich Palace. His father was King Henry VII, Henry Tudor, a man who seized the English throne not by succession, but by force, defeating and killing King Richard III at the Battle of Bosworth. It was the last major clash in what many would call the Wars of the Roses, a dynastic conflict between the houses of Lancaster and York. To legitimize his reign and calm the divided kingdom, Henry VII married Elizabeth of York, niece of the slain Richard III. That union was not one of romance, but of survival. 7 children were born to them, only 4 living past childhood. Among them was the third child, a boy named Henry, destined not to rule, but to stand in his brother Arthur's shadow. Yet the cost of a stolen crown was doubt. The throne Henry VII sat upon was never fully safe. Rumours, rebellions, pretenders, they circled like wolves. One of the most dangerous was Perkin Warbeck, claiming to be Richard of Shrewsbury, the lost prince, son of Edward IV, and rightful heir of York. Henry VII could not produce evidence that the real Richard was dead. And doubt, in politics, is poison. So the king staged a spectacle. When Henry was just 3 years old, he was given the title Duke of York, the same title the missing prince once bore. Crowds lined the streets to watch a toddler on horseback, riding proudly without help. A little boy declared as the new symbol of unity. A message. York is not returning. York is here, loyal, alive, and wearing Tudor red. Yet rebellion came in steel and flame. In the year 1495, the Cornish rose in revolt and marched toward London. The threat was real enough that the 5-year-old Henry and his mother fled to the Tower of London. Picture it. A small prince clutching his mother's hand in cold, torch-lit corridors while a kingdom trembled outside the walls. But in the quiet moments of his youth, Henry was cared for with affection. His mother, Elizabeth of York, taught him to read and write, and loved him deeply. He did not grow up like Arthur, trained to rule. Instead, he played with his sisters Margaret and Mary, reading poetry, singing, laughing. A boy full of energy, warmth, and brilliance. His early education was entrusted to poet John Skelton. Later, Lord Mountjoy took charge and arranged for 2 of Europe's greatest thinkers to meet the royal children, Erasmus of Rotterdam and Thomas More. They noted what others soon would. Young Henry was charming, witty, and hungry for attention. A prince who loved to shine. His childhood was a strange balance. Raised in silk, surrounded by fear, doted on, yet shadowed by danger. Not yet a tyrant, not yet a king. Just a boy, growing up beneath the weight of a fragile crown, destined, one day, to reshape the world. When Henry was still learning to walk, the weight of England's future rested not on his small shoulders, but on those of his elder brother Arthur. Arthur was named Prince of Wales and sent to Ludlow in the Welsh marches, following the precise model of how a future king should be trained. Far from home, schooled in governance, surrounded by counsellors, and prepared for power. Henry barely saw him, and the emotional bond between the two brothers was thin. Arthur's destiny was not simply to inherit England. It was to link England to a rising global power, Spain. His marriage to Catherine of Aragon, daughter of King Ferdinand II and Queen Isabella of Castile, was one of the most important diplomatic manoeuvres of Henry VII's reign. Henry, only 10 years old at the time, played a role in the wedding. He greeted Catherine upon her arrival in England, a chivalrous gesture from a child. But it was during the celebrations, under the candlelit ceilings of palace halls, that Henry revealed the first spark of what would define his nature forever. He tore off his jacket and danced wildly before the court, demanding attention without words. Even then, he craved the gaze of the world. But the dreams of Henry VII of unshakable alliances and secure succession collapsed swiftly. In the year 1502, Arthur died at Ludlow, likely from the mysterious sweating sickness that swept through England. He was 15. Suddenly, the Tudor dynasty had no heir, only a spare. Henry, the second son, raised without expectation of the crown, and now forced to wear it. Barely a year later, in the year 1503, Henry experienced a loss that went far deeper. His mother, Elizabeth of York, died due to complications in childbirth. If Arthur's death was a cold shift in royal priorities, Elizabeth's death was a wound that cut straight into Henry's heart. He was just 11. He wept publicly and privately, unable to bear the memory of her absence. That grief would follow him into adulthood, feeding his hunger for loyalty, control, and affection, hungers that would one day turn dangerous. Meanwhile, his father grew harder, darker. The paranoia born from usurping the crown had never left him, and it festered into policy. Henry VII created an organization known as the Council Learned in Law, run by two ruthless administrators, Edmund Dudley and Richard Empson. Their mission was to use bonds, fines, and financial levies to control the wealthy, even the nobles turning loyalty into debt. Henry watched all of this as a boy. He learned that a king does not simply rule, he manipulates, intimidates, and monetizes allegiance. Power, he saw, could be bought and secured through fear. And then there was Catherine of Aragon. The Spanish princess, newly widowed, was not sent home. Her dowry was too valuable. Henry VII had spent years arranging this marriage alliance and would not let death undo it. So he proposed something bold. Catherine would marry Henry. There was just one problem: the church. Marriage to a brother's widow was forbidden by Scripture. To allow the union, a dispensation was needed from Pope Julius II. The Vatican issued one, but in two versions. One vague about whether Catherine's marriage to Arthur had been consummated, the other declaring it certainly had been. Two documents, two possible truths and seeds of doubt that would one day grow into an empire-shattering crisis. Henry was just 12 when he was bound to Catherine, though only she was held by the vow. At 14, he was forced, under his father's instructions, to read aloud a repudiation of the betrothal. A calculated move. Henry VII could keep the dowry, maintain Catherine's presence in England, and still preserve options for a different alliance if needed. Thus, even before he wore the crown, Henry learned that oaths could be bent, laws manoeuvred, and marriages used as tools. Nothing, not a vow, not Scripture, was sacred if it stood in the way of royal ambition. In these formative years, with the death of Arthur, the sorrow of his mother's loss, and the cold calculations of his father's rule, Henry was shaped by a truth as sharp as a blade. In the world of kings, everything faith, love, duty were pieces on a board. And one day, he would come to play that game with terrifying skill. In the year 1509, King Henry VII died at the age of 52. His death was concealed for 2 days, time enough for the council to secure control and prepare for the transition. Then, with great relief and no small measure of celebration, a 17-year-old youth was proclaimed the new king, Henry VIII of England. Across the realm, there was a collective exhale. The reign of a penny-pinching king, one who had ruled with financial traps and shadow councils, was over. A new ruler had arrived. Handsome, athletic, musical, tall, a king who loved to hunt, sing, joust, and shine in gold and trappings. His first act was theatrical and shrewd. He ordered the arrest of Edmund Dudley and Richard Empson, the two most despised enforcers of his father's council learned in law. He accused them of treason on vague charges, justified only in words. It was enough. They were imprisoned, condemned, and executed. It was a blood gift to the people. The crowd cheered, and though few noticed it then, those executions were the first of many, the opening act of a reign where the promise of justice would often be served with the edge of an axe, especially when it suited the king. Then came a decision that would alter the course of the century. Henry chose to marry Catherine of Aragon. Despite the doubts of older advisers, he wed her on the 11th of June, 1509, and just 13 days later, on the 24th of June, the two were crowned as King and Queen of England at Westminster Abbey. At first, the marriage was gentle, warm, and stable. Catherine was 5 years older, wise, devout, politically seasoned. She had endured hardship, waited years in limbo, and stepped into queenship with a sense of duty. Henry, meanwhile, was young and radiant, a king of pageantry and movement. He held tournaments, hunted across his kingdom, composed songs, and surrounded himself with music, laughter, and spectacle. He spent his first year riding across England, jousting, hawking, hosting feasts, and giving the people something new, a king who seemed alive. But there was another question lingering beneath the glitter. What kind of king would Henry be? His father had been cautious, calculated, almost miserly. He avoided war, hoarded gold, and preferred account books to glory. Henry VIII wanted none of that. He dreamed of the battlefield, of banners snapping in French wind, of reclaiming the legend of Henry V, who had taken the field at Agincourt nearly a century before and forced France to its knees. When the cautious councillors advised peace with France and with Scotland, Henry rejected them. He did not want peace. He wanted greatness. He wanted to wear armour, command armies, and have his name carved into the memory of Europe. The world was already turning toward conflict. Pope Julius II had once formed the League of Cambrai uniting France, the Holy Roman Emperor Maximilian, and Ferdinand of Spain against Venice. But the alliance splintered. France marched into northern Italy and gained power. Alarmed, the Pope called for a new coalition, the Holy League, to expel the French. Henry saw his chance. In the year 1511, England joined the Holy League. The target was King Louis XII of France. Despite warnings, despite a treasury still recovering from his father's austerity, Henry surged forward eagerly. War. Victory. Recognition. He was hungry for all of it. Hungry to carve his place in history even as the shadows of doubt were beginning to move with him through the corridors of power. For now, though, the drums of war were beating, and Henry, young and crowned, blade in hand, was ready to meet them. The years that followed pulled the reign of Henry VIII into the whirlwind of European politics. His first attempt to invade France was a humiliating lesson. England and Spain had agreed to jointly reclaim Aquitaine land once held by England. Henry sent troops, trusting his father-in-law, King Ferdinand of Aragon. But Ferdinand had no intention of helping his young English son-in-law succeed. Instead, he used English troops as a diversion to seize Navarre for himself. Once he achieved his objective, he abandoned Henry's army, leaving them to retreat empty-handed, embarrassed, and betrayed. But Henry was not one to retreat forever. Despite the setback, he kept hunting for alliances. He courted Maximilian, the Holy Roman Emperor, and dreamed openly of being crowned King of France. He imagined himself riding into Paris, a conqueror, wearing a crown and brandishing titles once given by the Pope to those called Most Christian King. He wanted not just victory, but grandeur. In the year 1513, Henry crossed the Channel in person. What followed was less a war than a stage performance. At the so-called Battle of the Spurs, English and imperial forces startled a French cavalry detachment into flight. There was little bloodshed, yet Henry, with the help of clever propaganda, declared it a glorious triumph. Towns fell Tournai and Terouanne, and Henry revelled in this first taste of conquest. Meanwhile, back in England, Catherine of Aragon proved her worth. Acting as regent while Henry was away, She rallied the English forces against Scotland. On the 9th of September, 1513, at the Battle of Flodden, the Scots were crushed. Their king, James IV, Catherine's own brother-in-law, fell among thousands of his nobility. Catherine sent James's bloodied coat to Henry as a trophy. She had shown she could rule and fight when needed. The people loved her for it. Behind these campaigns stood a single, tireless mind, Thomas Wolsey. A priest of humble birth, Wolsey had risen by sheer talent. He managed logistics, pushed plans, and organized armies. Henry rewarded him first with the bishopric of Lincoln, then with the archbishopric of York. And finally, in the year 1515, Wolsey became a cardinal. He was brilliant, decisive, and stunningly efficient. Soon people whispered a dangerous truth. Wolsey, not Henry, was running the kingdom. But Europe was a chessboard with pieces constantly shifting. King Louis XII of France died in the year 1515. He was succeeded by Francis I, a young, charismatic, glory-seeking king whose profile mirrored Henry's own. Two proud men, both hungry for fame, both eager to expand their influence. Such men could not remain friends for long. Diplomacy became a dizzying sequence of alliances, broken promises, secret deals, and sudden betrayals. One year, England and Spain planned to strike France. The next year, Henry and Francis pledged friendship. Then the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V entered the stage, turning every bond into a bargaining chip. Henry waited for a decisive victory or lasting alliance, but time and again he found himself used, delayed, or ignored. England spent heavily. Little changed. Then, in the year 1518, Wolsey delivered a masterstroke. He negotiated the Treaty of London, a universal peace agreement with England at its heart. The terms were simple. All major powers agreed to defend one another if attacked. For a moment, Europe lay still, and Henry, through Wolsey, stood at the centre of it, praised as the arbiter of peace. What followed was spectacle on a scale Europe had rarely seen. In the year 1520, Henry met Francis at a place that would be remembered as the Field of Cloth of Gold. Thousands attended. Silk tents shone under the summer Sunday fountains poured wine. Banquets ran for days. The two kings embraced, wrestled, feasted, and paraded arm in arm. It was a festival of power, wealth, and masculine challenge, each man determined to outshine the other. Though they smiled fiercely for paintings and prayers, behind their eyes burned one question. Who was the true star of Europe? Henry was convinced he belonged on the highest stage, equal to Francis, equal to Charles. From this point forward, his pride and ambition would steer England toward darker waters, not with drums and wine this time, but with swords, secrets, and later, blood. While Henry buried himself in war and diplomacy, another storm was sweeping across Europe, the Reformation. In the German states, a monk named Martin Luther stood openly against the Pope and the Catholic Church, condemning corruption, the sale of indulgences, and the abuse of ecclesiastical power. He was excommunicated, declared a heretic, yet his writings spread faster than edicts could suppress them. Word eventually reached Henry, the self-styled scholar king, who prided himself on theological understanding and saw himself as a natural defender of the papal order. So, Henry picked up his pen. With the assistance of Thomas More and other learned clerics, he composed a treatise titled A Defence of the Seven Sacraments. Published in the year 1518, the book reaffirmed papal supremacy and sharply denounced Luther's positions. Though not a masterpiece of original theology, it was astonishing for one reason. It was written by a reigning king. The book was printed many times, translated across Europe, and provoked a direct rebuttal from Luther himself. Henry's reputation soared, and in response to his staunch loyalty, Pope Leo X granted him a rare honorific, Defender of the Faith. The tragedy, almost comedic in its irony, is that only a few years later, the same king who defended the Pope with his pen would be the one to shatter England's bond with Rome. That fracture began not with theology, but with a family crisis. Catherine of Aragon had done her duty. She had given Henry loyalty, diplomacy, stability, but she failed at the one task that mattered above all, producing a healthy male heir. She conceived several times, but only one child lived beyond infancy, a daughter, Mary. Others were stillborn, or died before christening. England had never had a ruling queen in her own right. If Mary ascended, her husband would wield power. That unsettled Henry. His father had earned a crown with steel. Would his daughter lose it with a marriage contract? Slowly, Henry's affection for Catherine withered. He drifted toward other women. In the year 1519, one of his mistresses, Elizabeth Bessie Blount, gave birth to a son, Henry Fitzroy. The king acknowledged the boy, granted him titles, and raised him like a prince. That alarmed many. Henry, they whispered, might try to legitimize his bastard, but even that would not solve the question of succession. Bessie was gone from court, and Catherine was now past 40, her chances of bearing children fading. In that fertile silence of court gossip and political tension, another figure stepped forward, a young woman with dark eyes and French polish. Anne Boleyn. Anne had once served in the court of the French queen. She had learned courtly manners, fashion, and the language of flirtation. She was witty, educated, and curious, particularly about the writings of reformers like Tyndale and the translated scriptures beginning to circulate in Europe. Most importantly, she was not like the other women Henry had known. Anne refused to be seduced. She would not be the king's mistress. She would not share his bed unless he made her his queen. This refusal inflamed Henry's desire into obsession. He wrote her dozens of letters, slipped her jewels, and followed her through the palace like a young suitor, not a king. Anne held firm, "Unless you marry me, I will not come to you." What began as a pursuit of passion soon twisted into something far deeper and darker. Catherine of Aragon was still his wife, but Anne Boleyn represented youth, possibility, and hope for a son. Henry's longing for male succession merged with his wounded pride. No one tells a king no. By the early 1820s, Henry had convinced himself that his marriage to Catherine had been cursed from the start. He declared publicly that Leviticus forbade marriage to a brother's widow, and God, he argued, had punished him with dead sons to prove it. From private yearning, this matter became a national crisis. Henry wanted annulment not in secret, but recognized by church and kingdom. The spark had been struck. With Anne in his sights and a papal dispensation in his way, Henry would soon take steps that would rupture centuries of religious authority, ignite rebellions, and change not just England, but all of Christendom. A king in love, a church in danger, a world about to shift, all because one man could not accept no. Henry VIII began his campaign to annul his marriage to Catherine of Aragon by enlisting the help of Cardinal Wolsey, the most powerful man in England, after the king himself. Under Henry's direction, Wolsey crafted a religious justification that, on its surface, sounded plausible. Their marriage, he claimed, was invalid in the eyes of God. Henry quoted the book of Leviticus. "If a man shall take his brother's wife, it is an unclean thing. They shall be childless." And Henry believed or claimed to believe that this explained why he had no living male heir. The curse was divine. The sin was scriptural. But Catherine stood firm. She declared that her marriage to Arthur, Henry's elder brother, had never been consummated. She had entered marriage with Henry as a virgin, making the union lawful. What's more, she pointed to Deuteronomy, which stated that a man should marry his brother's widow to carry on the family line. This was no longer a debate about scripture. It was a debate about who had the authority to interpret it, the King of England or the Pope of Rome. Wolsey, who had risen from humble beginnings to serve Henry with near fanatical loyalty, found himself trapped. He spent months persuading the Pope to declare the marriage null, but at the worst time imaginable, Rome fell into hostile hands. In the year 1527, soldiers of Emperor Charles V, who happened to be Catherine's nephew, sacked Rome. Pope Clement VII became, effectively, a prisoner. Under imperial pressure, he could not rule against Catherine. Catherine, shrewd and composed, appealed her case directly to Rome. She knew she had the Pope's sympathy, and so the cracks in Wolsey's grand designs began to appear. Desperate, Wolsey proposed another solution. A court convened in England, overseen jointly by himself and the Pope's representative, Cardinal Campeggio. The court opened at Blackfriars in London in the summer of 1529. Before it, Catherine made a moment forever etched in history. She walked into the hall, where Henry sat on his throne, knelt before him, and said in a trembling but firm voice, "I take God to witness that I have been to you a true and loyal wife. I was a true maid without touch of man when I came into your bed." Then, refusing to accept the court's authority, she stood, turned her back on the king, and walked out of the room. She would not return. Without her, no judgment could be valid. Days later, the Pope officially halted the proceedings. The trial dissolved. Henry's hopes shattered, and Wolsey's fate was sealed. Henry, humiliated and furious, turned his anger on the man who had once been his unwavering servant. Wolsey was charged with praemunire, the crime of upholding foreign authority, the Pope's, over the king's. His lands were seized, his offices stripped. He surrendered Hampton Court, the palace he had built, to the very king who destroyed him. Then came the final blow. In the year 1530, Wolsey was arrested and ordered to stand trial for treason. But on his journey back to London, he fell gravely ill. At Leicester Abbey, weakened by stress and suffering, he whispered his last words. "Had I but served my God as diligently as I have served my king, he would not have given me over in my grey hairs." Wolsey, the architect of Henry's European ambitions, the man who dreamed of making England the pivot of a united Christendom, died abandoned, a crushed pawn of the king he had tried to please. And with his death, something shifted inside Henry. He was no longer just a charismatic monarch who jousted for applause and composed songs for his court. He was becoming something more dangerous. A king who would break anything, betray anyone, even the church itself, to get what he wanted. The age of festivals and tournaments was over. The age of ruin was beginning. After Wolsey's fall, Henry turned to another man, Sir Thomas More, to serve as Lord Chancellor. More was a scholar of the highest calibre, author of Utopia, a man of profound conscience and unwavering loyalty to the Catholic Church. But Henry no longer desired conscience. He needed compliance. He did not want a moral compass, he wanted a cutter of chains. More refused to sign off on the annulment, but he did not openly oppose it. He kept silent, neutral. It was not enough for Henry. As the case for annulment stalled in Rome, Henry changed his strategy. If he could not win the Pope, he would remove the Pope from the equation entirely. Between the year 1529 and the year 1533, Parliament, with Henry pulling the strings, passed a sequence of acts aimed at weakening the authority of the Church in England. Priests were attacked for abuses of power. Clerical courts were limited. Church revenues were targeted. The message was clear. Church privilege must bend to the law of the land, and the land was ruled by Henry. This campaign was clever. It rode the wave of popular resentment against a wealthy, insulated clergy. Henry had found his wedge religion as a tool of politics. Then, in the year 1533, Anne Boleyn became pregnant. It might be a son. Time was now his enemy and his excuse. In January of that year, Henry secretly married her. A new Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas Cranmer, a man more yielding to Henry's vision, was appointed and immediately put to use. On the 23rd of May, 1533, Cranmer declared Henry's marriage to Catherine invalid. 5 days later, he pronounced Henry's marriage to Anne valid. A royal decree sealed it. The Queen was replaced, the Church overruled. The final blow came a year later. In the year 1534, Parliament passed the Act of Supremacy. Its language was stark and revolutionary. Henry VIII is the supreme head of the Church of England. No bishop, cardinal, or pope held any authority above him in English spiritual matters. Every English subject was now required to swear an oath affirming the king's supremacy. Refusal meant treason, a death sentence. It was not just a marriage that had been annulled. A kingdom had been severed from Rome. No Western monarch had ever dared to break so boldly with the Catholic Church. It marked the birth of a national church with the king at its altar, a merger of crown and cross. Thomas More could not stomach it. He refused to swear the oath. Forced to stand trial, he was convicted on charges of treason. On the 6th of July, in the year 1535, he was taken to Tower Hill and beheaded. His final words echoed with quiet defiance. "I die the king's good servant, but God's first." England had crossed a threshold. Henry was no longer simply a king, but a spiritual authority. A man who could annul marriages with divine backing. who could erase laws with the swing of a scepter. The divorce from Catherine had been merely the spark. The real rupture was far larger. A divorce not just from a queen but from Rome. And in the silence that followed his first execution of conscience, Henry stood taller, more dangerous. He had rewritten the rules. He would not stop here. England, once a loyal daughter of the Catholic Church, had become an island, politically and spiritually set apart. And the man at its helm, both sovereign and supreme head of religion, had discovered the taste of absolute power. There was no going back. Anne Boleyn, once the untouchable mistress who made a king tremble, became Queen of England in the middle of the year 1533, when she gave birth to her first child. But the child was a girl named Elizabeth. Henry was disappointed. He had torn his country from Rome for a son, not a daughter. Still, Anne was celebrated as the new queen loudly, defiantly, and with no small dose of scandal. She was not a quiet consort. She was sharp, ambitious, adept in politics, a supporter of religious reform, and she made enemies everywhere she walked. Catherine of Aragon, displaced and humiliated, was stripped of the title Queen and demoted to Dowager Princess of Wales, the title she had held as Arthur's widow. Her daughter Mary was declared illegitimate, her princess status replaced with the status of a bastard. Mother and daughter were forbidden to see one another. Catherine died in the year 1536 alone, exiled, with only her faith for company. When Henry was told, he dressed in yellow, the colour of celebration, and held a feast. Many saw it as a sign of cruelty, a cold-hearted victory dance. Anne, meanwhile, began to feel the pressure. She suffered miscarriages. Her influence over Henry waned. She clashed with powerful men at court. To defend her place, Anne doubled down. She pushed for harsher suppression of Catholic sympathizers, supported the expulsion of monks, and oversaw the seizure of monastic lands. These dissolutions, which began in earnest after the year 1536, sparked anger across the country. Rebellion began to stir. In January of that same year, Anne miscarried a male fetus. To Henry, who had nearly died just days earlier from a jousting accident, it seemed like fate. Anne claimed the shock of his injury caused her loss. Henry saw it differently, a sign from God. And by then, his attention had already shifted. Her replacement stood quietly in the wings. Jane Seymour, gentle, soft-spoken, obedient, served as a lady-in-waiting to both Catherine and Anne. She was everything Anne was not: submissive, modest, and supremely cautious. Henry found in her not only the possibility of peace, but the promise of a son. The king's eye wandered, and Anne sensed the end approaching. Thomas Cromwell, the very man who engineered Henry's break with Rome and his rise as head of the church, now turned against Anne. They were no longer allies. She stood in his way, and she had questioned his power. So Cromwell prepared a trap. He concocted charges of adultery, treason, and even incest with her own brother, George Boleyn. Evidence was thin, testimonies were forced, but Henry did not hesitate. Anne was arrested in May. Her trial was swift, guilty on all counts. On the 19th of May, 1536, Anne Boleyn was executed by a French swordsman specially summoned for the task, Henry's final gift to the woman he once swore he could not live without. She knelt upright, without a block, and uttered no accusation, only a calm prayer for the king's well-being. Henry celebrated, and 11 days later he married Jane Seymour, the same king who once wrote A Defence of the Seven Sacraments to uphold papal authority, who had wept bitterly at the death of his mother, who had once showered Cardinal Wolsey with gifts, now killed his own wife, through laws he himself had authored. And Anne was only the second. There were still 4 queens to come. Jane Seymour, the third wife, brought a rare calm to Henry's storm-tossed household. Gentle and obedient, she avoided the political games that had ensnared her predecessor. In October of the year 1537, she delivered what Henry had desired for more than 20 years: a son, Prince Edward. The bells rang, the guns fired, and Henry celebrated as though the crown itself had been reborn. But triumph turned swiftly to tragedy. 12 days after the prince's birth, Jane died from postnatal complications, likely puerperal infection. For once, Henry wept openly. He wore mourning black. He refused to remarry for over 2 years. Jane was the only wife he later chose to be buried beside. For her, and her alone, he revealed a rare fragment of the man he might have been capable of love, grief, and quiet loyalty. But while Jane lived, England burned. The year 1536 saw the outbreak of a massive uprising in the north, the Pilgrimage of Grace. It was no mere rebellion of swords, but a procession of tens of thousands carrying crosses, chanting prayers, demanding justice. The cause: the dissolution of the monasteries. Thomas Cromwell, acting under Henry's authority, had begun tearing down smaller religious houses. Lands were seized, monks were expelled, holy relics were smashed or sold. The monasteries, long centres of education, charity, and medical care, vanished into stone heaps and auction lists. The North, deeply Catholic and fiercely loyal to old customs, erupted. 50,000 men marched, led by lawyers, priests, and commoners alike, demanding, restore Catherine's daughter Mary to legitimacy, punish Cromwell and his evil council, return the church to Rome. At first, Henry faltered. He negotiated, promised pardons, met with leaders. When the rebels dispersed peacefully, believing the king's word, Henry struck. Under false pretenses, the leaders were arrested, tried as traitors, and killed. Their bodies hung from York's walls, heads spiked along bridges. The message was ritual and ruthless. Disobey the king's religion, and you will die. From that moment, England crossed the Rubicon. Acts of Parliament tightened the noose. The Act of Succession and the Act of Treason made it a capital crime to deny Henry's supremacy over the church. Not taking the oath was treason. Staying silent could be treason. Words, or lack of words, were now punishable by death. The air of England grew colder. Men whispered prayers in fear. An unspoken dread seeped into parishes and taverns alike. Any neighbour might inform, any word might condemn. Henry lived the paradox he had created. He attended Mass daily, yet burned monks at the stake. He commissioned English translations of Scripture, yet executed those who opposed them. He still bore the papal title Defender of the Faith, yet in the year 1538, he was formally excommunicated by Pope Paul III. The Tudor realm had severed itself entirely from Rome, but not in peace. England, once a daughter of the Universal Church, was now a nation ruled by sword and scripture, its king both guardian and destroyer of faith. Outwardly, Henry stood triumphant father to a son, head of his own church, master of parliament and pulpit. But beneath that confident mask lay a kingdom trembling under the weight of transformation. A new world was forming, and so was a new kind of ruler. The English crown had fused itself to the altar. No one, least of all Henry, could predict how terrible the price would be. After Jane Seymour's death, Henry once again required a wife this time, not for love or heirs, but for politics. Spain and France were now both adversaries, and England needed new allies. Henry's gaze turned toward the Protestant princes of the Schmalkaldic League, a coalition of German states united not by territory, but by shared religious reform, Luther's reform. To cement this alliance against Emperor Charles V and Rome, a marriage was arranged. The chosen bride was Anne of Cleves, sister of the Duke of Cleves. Hans Holbein, the king's favoured painter, was sent to capture her likeness. The portrait returned showed a gentle, fair-featured woman, modest, refined. Henry, pleased with the image, agreed to the match. But when Anne arrived in England, and Henry met her in person, his reaction was immediate and public. "She is nothing like her picture," he muttered. He later described her as a Flanders mare. The king's pride was bruised, yet the machinery of diplomacy was already in motion. They married on the 6th of January, 1540. The marriage soured immediately. On their wedding night, Henry later claimed, "I could not consummate. She did not inspire me." He blamed her appearance, her manner, even her smell. Within 6 months, with Anne's reluctant consent, the marriage was annulled. The grounds cited were non-consummation and a pre-contract. Anne accepted the outcome with grace, took her settlement in estates and jewels, and lived peacefully as the king's beloved sister. She would outlive all of Henry's other wives. Thomas Cromwell, however, the architect of this disastrous alliance, did not survive. The powerful Howard family, led by the Duke of Norfolk, seized their moment. With Henry's humiliation fresh in mind, they accused Cromwell of treason, heresy, and overreaching ambition. On the 28th of July, 1540, Cromwell was taken to Tower Hill. In a brutal twist of fate, the man who had engineered the deaths of queens and the destruction of monasteries now knelt before the axe himself. On the very same day Cromwell died, Henry married his fifth wife, Catherine Howard, the 19-year-old niece of the Duke of Norfolk. Catherine was everything Henry's life had lacked: youthful, vital, seemingly pure. He was 49, crippled by leg ulcers, obese and irritable, but he adored her. He called her a rose without a thorn. He lavished her with jewels, dresses, banquets, and public displays of affection. But the very thing he worshipped her youth was also the doom of them both. Rumours surfaced. Whispers that Catherine had been intimate with men before her marriage, that she still entertained a lover, Thomas Culpeper, while queen. Investigators found letters, testimonies, locked doors. Henry's heart shattered. He wept, raged, swore, and finally descended into the cold logic of his own laws. Treason. On the 13th of February, 1542, Catherine Howard was beheaded at the Tower of London. She was 19 years old. So in less than 6 years, 3 meteors had burned across Henry's sky. Anne Boleyn, Thomas Cromwell, Catherine Howard. Each had risen to near unseen heights. Each had been extinguished at the king's command. All of them were once loved, trusted, promised endless glory. All of them died by his will, and this was only the 30th year of his reign. The final 6 years still lay ahead. Years swollen with war, sickness, paranoia, and the slow decay of a king who could conquer nations but never master the hunger within himself. By the final years of his reign, Henry VIII was no longer the golden youth who had once ridden into battle with a lance under his arm. He weighed nearly 140 kilograms. His waist measured close to 1.30 meters. The old jousting wound that had once been a badge of honour had festered into a massive ulcer on his leg, an open, stinking wound that oozed pus and had to be drained daily. The odour was so overwhelming that courtiers lit perfumed candles near his bed, simply to endure being in the same room. He could no longer mount a horse, could barely walk. A system of pulleys was installed so that he might be hoisted onto his throne. His specially tailored boots could no longer contain the swollen flesh. He had become a king of ceremony with a body that betrayed him at every turn. And yet the decay of his flesh did nothing to dull his hunger for war. In those last years, with disease gnawing at his body and paranoia clouding his mind, Henry threw himself into one final campaign, a war against France and Scotland that historians would later call the Rough Wooing, or simply the Old Man's War. In the year 1544, Henry allied once more with the Holy Roman Empire, headed by Emperor Charles V, and launched an attack on France. Thousands of English soldiers crossed the Channel and found themselves digging trenches through mud, disease, and freezing rain. The city of Boulogne fell. Henry rejoiced. But the victory parades he once led with such pride now happened without him. He was too large, too sick, and too riddled with pain to ride a horse. Then came the final blow. Charles V broke his alliance and signed a separate peace with France. Henry was left exposed, his costly triumph hollow. The war dragged on until the year 1546, bleeding England of funds and lives. It ended without glory, only debts, graves, and further proof that the king's dreams had outrun his strength. At home, Henry's wrath turned inward. The dissolution of the monasteries, once begun under Cromwell, continued. Every remaining abbey and convent was seized. Sacred relics were torn from altars, statues smashed, priests expelled. Lands sold to nobility who became wealthy overnight and forever bound to the Tudor cause. This new class of power would shape England's politics for generations, but beneath their rise, seeds of religious bitterness were sown. Seeds that would bloom in blood during the reigns of Henry's children. Meanwhile, Henry's temper and judgment destabilized. He grew erratic, turning against allies, changing policy with alarming speed, drowning his court in fear. Any who stood too close risked being burned or broken. In one infamous session, Henry ordered the execution of 5 men on the same day, 3 Roman Catholic priests and 2 radical reformers. Both factions thought themselves loyal to England. Both died for standing 3 inches off the king's shifting line. It did not matter what creed you stood for, Rome or reform, Latin or English liturgy, if you failed to bend exactly when the king willed it, you were marked for destruction. The once charming monarch who had danced at court and written love songs had become a godless judge of men's souls. A king who prayed aloud and signed death warrants in the same breath. A ruler who dreamed of Arthurian glory, yet ended up ruling over a nation trembling between faith and fear. Those last years were not just a time of conquest and pain, they were the forging of a new England, altered forever by one man's compulsions, wounds, and will. And Henry, swollen with sickness, wielding absolute authority, still believed himself chosen by God, even as his own body rotted beneath him. In the year 1543, with the kingdom still stained in blood, Henry married for the sixth and final time. His new queen was Catherine Parr, a noble widow of keen intellect and graceful presence. She was not young like Catherine Howard, nor fiery like Anne Boleyn. She was educated, gentle, thoughtful, and she would become the last light in Henry's darkening world. Catherine Parr brought something back into Henry's life that had long been missing: dignity. She did not merely attend to the king, she cared for his children, who were scattered by scandal, politics, and neglect. Mary, the eldest, now in her late 20s, still carried the wound of being declared illegitimate. Elizabeth, the daughter of Anne Boleyn, was a brilliant but cautious young girl of 10, unsure if she would ever be recognized as a princess again. And Edward, barely 5 years old, was the prized heir, revered, but raised in a court thick with tension and intrigue. Catherine embraced them all. She revived their education, bringing tutors fluent in Latin, Greek, Italian, and French. She encouraged them to read Erasmus, Plato, and the scriptures in English. With her, the royal household once again became a place of learning. Edward wrote letters beyond his age. Elizabeth translated prayers from Latin before she became a teenager. Mary, through Catherine's quiet insistence, reconnected with her father and regained a semblance of her old status. For the first time in years, the Tudor children were united not in title, but at the dinner table, under the care of a woman who truly wished to mend them. Catherine Parr was also a woman of letters herself. She wrote prayers, composed meditations, and kept a steady pen, even publishing a devotional book, Prayers or Meditations, in 1545, becoming the first woman to publish under her own name in English history. She believed in reform, but not rebellion. She believed in scripture, but did not deny tradition. And crucially, she could speak to Henry about God and governance subjects he had long ceased to hear, without seeing them as threats. But even this warmth could not escape Henry's storms. As Catherine's influence grew, so did envy in the court. Her interest in reformed faith made her a suspect in the eyes of those loyal to the old church. When she dared challenge Henry in theological debate, sometimes correcting him in public, it stirred the king's wounded pride. In the year 1546, a trap was laid. A group of conservative courtiers sent a report to Henry, accusing Catherine of spreading heresy. She was plotting against the king, they said. She had books of forbidden doctrine. Henry signed the order to arrest her. The next day, Catherine was informed. She did not argue. She did not protest her innocence. Instead, when Henry came to her chambers, she fell to her knees and wept, pleading that she had only wished to learn from him, never to lecture him. Her debates, she said, were merely a ruse to distract him from his pain. Henry paused. Something in him softened, perhaps for the last time. The order was torn apart. The guards who arrived at the palace door the next morning found themselves dismissed. Catherine Parr, through humility and fear, had survived the axe. She would outlive Henry by a year. The only wife to do so. No divorce, no execution, no exile. When Henry died in the year 1547, Catherine stepped quietly aside and watched from afar as Edward became king at 9, Mary after him, and then Elizabeth, the daughter of the queen who had knelt before the sword. Catherine Parr had survived not by being the loudest or the most beautiful, but by being the most perceptive. She entered Henry's broken life not to control him, but to heal what she could, the kingdom, the children, and perhaps even the remnants of his soul. You could almost say that, in a reign red with blades, she was the last soft whisper of grace. In the final nights of his life, Henry VIII lay trapped beneath the weight of his own body. Four-poster bed, carved with dragons and Tudor roses, shifting under a man who could no longer shift himself. His flesh had become a prison, ulcerated, swollen, unbearable. Every attempt to move sent pain shooting through his leg, his abdomen, his back. The king, who had once leapt from horseback in full armour, could now barely raise his head. His courtiers watched from the shadows of the chamber. Not one dared speak aloud what they all knew. The king was dying. For the laws Henry himself had instituted made it treason to suggest a sovereign was close to death. Thus, out of fear, no one asked the question every dying man deserves. Do you wish to make your confession? There were no final rites, no absolution. And so, when the morning of the 28th of January, in the year 1547 broke over London, the royal household awoke to find that Henry, King of England, supreme head of the church, defender of the faith, had slipped away silently in the night. He was 55 years old. No priest had attended him. His last breath left his body beneath tapestries thick with golden thread. His death was announced without ceremony. There was no great procession at first, no hymns or bells. Too many feared what would come next. And yet, even in death, Henry's story refused to leave quietly. When his body was transported from Whitehall to Windsor, placed inside a sturdy coffin lined with lead, something went wrong. The coffin split during the journey, perhaps under its own weight, perhaps from a fragile seal. Blood and putrid fluids seeped through the cracks, dripping onto the stone floor of Sion Abbey where it rested overnight. A stray dog wandered in, drawn by the scent. It licked the blood from the floor. Witnesses whispered to one another, then to others on the road, and soon all the way to Windsor. The prophecy has been fulfilled. Hem. They spoke of an old legend, words allegedly written by Thomas Becket centuries earlier, predicting that a king who would defy the church would die like a beast of the field, his blood lapped by dogs. Whether the story was true hardly mattered. For the man who had built palaces, broken queens, and severed England from Rome, death came not with trumpets or triumph, but in silent decay. A monarch who demanded control of every soul in his kingdom lost control of his own. And in that quiet, a strange truth seemed to whisper through England. Hamlet had yet to be written, but the line was already living itself out. He was a man who might have proved most noble, had he not fallen so. Tomorrow, a boy of 9 would be crowned king. Tonight, England was finally free to breathe. Henry's body was interred in the royal vault beneath St. George's Chapel, Windsor, beside Jane Seymour, the one wife he always claimed to have truly loved. This was Henry's own wish, that in death he would lie next to the woman who gave him a son, and whom he mourned more sincerely than all the others. Yet even that final gesture of devotion reveals the quiet irony of his legacy. Jane, who barely lived a year as queen, would forever share eternity with the most notorious husband in English history. Henry had grand plans for his tomb. He envisioned a colossal marble sepulchre, adorned with bronze angels and allegorical figures. He commissioned a life-size effigy of himself, mounted on horseback, with cannons cast in bronze and trumpeting archangels perched above. The structure was meant to rival the tombs of ancient emperors, a final statement of power carved in stone, sound and splendor. It was never built. Wars drained the treasury. Successive rulers, Edward VI, Mary I, Elizabeth I, had bigger problems than fulfilling the grand burial fantasy of a father, brother or tyrant. The pieces of the monument were left to gather dust in Westminster Abbey, then to be dismantled, carried off and repurposed. By the time the Stuart dynasty rose to power, parts of the structure had been melted down, others tossed aside. One massive piece of black marble, intended to support the king's own sculpted horse, was eventually repurposed in the 1700s as a tombstone for General John Wolfe, a hero of the 7 Years' War. 2 centuries after Henry died, in the late 18th century, the royal vault was pried open during renovation. What they found was almost nothing. A dented lead coffin, a few scattered bones, no gleaming bronze angels, no marble carvings, no golden roses. The king, who had commanded an entire church, seized monastic lands, destroyed abbeys, and signed the death warrants of queens, now lay in anonymity. His tomb bore no statue, no crown, no proclamation of glory, only a single, slightly tarnished brass plaque affixed to a stone slab. 4 words in Latin: Henricus Rex, Jane Regina, King Henry, Queen Jane. The man who shattered the Catholic Church in England, who stood before Europe as defender of the faith and supreme head of the church, who spilled the blood of wives, monks, nobles, and chancellors alike, now lies in a quiet corner under flagstones trod by tourists and choir boys. No candles burn for him, no pilgrims kneel, and on most days no one even stops to read the name. Night falls, and somewhere in the endless corridors of memory, Henry VIII still rides. In his dreams, he is young again, lean, shining with sweat and triumph, his horse pounding through the soft English earth beneath him. He lifts his lance, eyes narrowed towards some imagined enemy. He hears the cheers. He feels the world bending beneath his will. Or perhaps he is standing alive and magnificent above the great courtyard of Hampton Court Palace, the music swelling, courtiers bowing low. Anne Boleyn watches with her dark, laughing eyes. Jane smiles gently from a window above. Catherine Parr leans over a book, her fingers tracing scripture. Mary, Elizabeth, Edward, little figures in the tapestry of a kingdom still untouched by blood and loss. But the truth creeps closer each night, in the silence beneath the silk canopy. Henry had everything. Power absolute, wealth uncounted. 6 crowns, 6 weddings, 6 beds warmed by trembling queens. Yet the one thing he could never conquer was the hunger that hollowed him from within. The hunger to be loved and never betrayed. He was not a monster, not entirely. And he was never a saint, no matter what the chroniclers tried to write. Henry VIII was simply a man given too much power over too many lives, and haunted by a fear so deep, so primal, it consumed every bond he ever formed. He feared betrayal, and so he destroyed trust. He feared abandonment, and so he became the one to abandon first. He feared dying without a son, and so he shattered a church, beheaded a wife, and shattered his country in 2. In the end, 6 women crossed his bed, and each left behind a fragment of her soul, a cold piece of her body, or the ghost of her last breath. None of them were whole when they left. Neither was he. And so, as we close this long, sleepless tale, imagine him for the last time, a king on a high stone balcony, his robes heavy, his crown tilting, the stars cold above his head. Under his feet, a void, a grave he dug himself, with every decree, every kiss, every execution roll signed in trembling ink. And then, like every other story we whisper in the dark, all of it returns to earth and goes quiet. The night grows softer, the world grows dim, wishing you peace and a gentle rest. Good night. Hey guys, tonight we will step together into the shadows of a name that, at the mere mention, has shaken the course of history. Henry VIII. A king who possessed everything a man of his time could possibly dream of. Absolute power, rare talent, and a kingdom ready to submit to his every command. But do not let the golden veneer deceive you. Henry VIII was the man who wrote a book to defend the Pope, only to later tear the church apart with his own hands, crowning himself as the supreme head of faith. He swore to love a woman until his last breath, then sent her to the scaffold simply because she did not give him a son. He was once a handsome and intelligent prince, a musician, an athlete, a storyteller, a passionate lover, and then became an executioner of his own wives, closed the monasteries, and hanged those who dared remain loyal to God. Was Henry VIII a genius? Or just a child who never grew up, terrified of abandonment, needing to control the hearts of millions?